have a question for you. Could you live without human affection? If everyone that you knew and loved suddenly shunned you for something you had no control over, could you survive? I was alone for 12 years. My friends, my husband, my children, they were afraid to touch me. They were afraid that I was going to make them unclean. They were afraid that if they touched me, then my curse would become their curse. And so for 12 years, the only physical contact I had was the rough hands of doctors. Doctors who I knew would rush off to purify themselves as soon as I left. Doctors who eventually gave up on me as a hopeless case. And so I withdrew from the world, not out of courtesy to those people who were afraid of me, but because I couldn't bear one more rejection. I remember that one day. I was sitting in this dark corner of the street by myself, and I was done. I couldn't go on like this anymore. And as I sat there contemplating the only option that I felt that I had left, suddenly I heard this noise out on the street. And I looked up, and there were all of these people just flowing out from the side streets and the houses, and they were all gathering in this crowd and shouting and pushing and shoving, and they were all trying to get to something right in the middle. And then, just for this briefest second, the crowd parted just enough, and I saw his face. And even as they closed again and I lost sight of him, for the first time in 12 years, I had hope. And so I didn't stop and think about what I was doing. I just started running towards that crowd. And when I got there, I didn't consider the consequences. I just started pushing the people out of my way. All that I knew was that I had to get to that man in the center. And I kept pushing, and the people were shoving me, and they were shouting, and they were cursing, and there was so much noise that everything they said was just lost in this clamor. And finally, I was almost there, and I could see him, and there were these men with him, and they were trying to clear a path so that he could walk, and nobody cared. Everyone wanted to touch him. Everyone wanted to talk to him and see him. And I was almost there, and there was just one more person left between us, this woman. And so I put out my hand on her shoulder to push her out of the way, and she turned and looked at me. And it was my neighbor, a woman who I had known for most of my life. And she recognized me. And her face just contorted with anger because she knew what I had done when I touched her. And I saw her hand come up, and I felt this sting across my face. And I fell to my knees, not from the force of her blow, but from shock as reality came crashing back down. How could I possibly think that this man, this stranger, would view me any differently than people I had known and loved for my entire life? And as I knelt there in the dirt, suddenly this pair of feet stopped in front of me, and I looked up, and there he was. This fight had broken out in front of him, and his friends were trying to break it up so that he could keep moving, and he just stood there watching them silently, and he hadn't seen me. And in that moment, I knew that if I touched his clothes, I would be made well. And so I reached out my hand, and I'd never realized how far a few inches can be. It was like trying to pluck a star from the night sky, and finally I caught the edge of his cloak, and the fringe slipped through my fingers. And I felt this warmth spreading through my body, not from my hands, but from my heart. And before I could really understand what had just happened, I heard this terrible voice cut through the crowd, bringing everyone around us to silence. Who touched my clothes? He knew. He knew what I had done to him. He knew that I had made him unclean, and he was going to punish me for it. And I tried to back away, but there were people behind me, and I couldn't get away. And he just kept saying, "Who touched my clothes?" And I could hear his friends trying to reason with him, saying, "How can you possibly ask that? There are so many people around here. You can't possibly know who touched you." And he just kept saying, "Who touched my clothes?" And finally, I knew I had to tell him, and so I fell down at his feet. And I shouted out, "It was me! It was me. I have bled 12 years. And I knew that if I touched you, then I would finally be made well. And the moment that I did, the bleeding stopped. And there was complete silence. And I could feel every eye on me. And then I felt this hand on my shoulder, and I looked up. And he was kneeling in front of me, smiling. And he took my hands in his and lifted me to my feet. And he touched my cheek where it was still stinging. And he said to me, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go and be at peace." Consider those last words for a moment. Go and be at peace. There's something very resonant about them. Go and be at peace. Like bells ringing softly through the sanctuary, or birds singing as the sun comes up. Go and be at peace. Words so simple, yet so powerful. But when Jesus says those words, talking about? When we read this passage, we tend to focus on the wildly miraculous physical healing that the woman undergoes. She had had a hemorrhage for 12 years, but the moment that she touches Jesus' cloak, the bleeding stops. Incredible, but for most of us, not very relatable. But there's a second healing that takes place in this story. This healing is not physical, but it is perhaps even more miraculous. The woman in the story has bled for 12 years, and as a result, she has been ritually unclean for 12 years. She has suffered over a decade under the cultural stigma surrounding menstruation that said a menstruating woman and anything she touched was unclean, was unfit to stand before God. Because her bleeding would not stop, she could never purify herself and return to her normal life. No one around her could touch her without also becoming unclean. If she was young when her illness began, she never would have been able to marry. If she was old, her husband could have divorced her for it. And although the text doesn't say, I've always imagined her as a wife and mother, abandoned by her loved ones for something that she cannot control. And so she spent 12 years alone, 12 years without a hug or a kiss, 12 years without holding her children, 12 years without ever being touched by the people she loves, because she lived in a culture that didn't value her as a person, a culture that only saw her illness. There are some wounds that cannot be seen. When the woman reaches out to Jesus for healing, she is seeking physical healing, relief from her illness, relief from her endless bleeding. Yet the healing that she receives goes so much deeper. In that moment, Jesus could have continued walking. He could have left her there, healed of her illness, and gone on without saying a word to her. But he didn't. He calls out to the crowd, "Who touched my clothes?" And that question is so important because honestly, do you really think that he didn't know? This man who seems to know what everyone is thinking, did he really not know which person in the crowd had touched him and received healing? But he asks, because it means that she then must proclaim that she is healed in front of this entire crowd, in front of people who probably knew her and knew what she had suffered, people who had participated in shunning her, who had added to her pain by rejecting her. When he tells her that her faith has made her well, he is saying that she is responsible for her own healing. Her faith, not any of his actions, has healed her. This unclean woman, unfit to stand before God in the eyes of her neighbors, had the faith strong enough to heal herself. But what is most significant is that he does not tell her then, "Go purify yourself so that you can enter back into society." Unlike in Matthew 8 when he heals a leper and tells the man to go to a priest to prove that he is cleansed, he doesn't say a word in this passage about purification. He simply tells her, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." He knows that by touching him, she had made him unclean, that she had made many people in the crowd unclean as she pushed past them to reach him. But that is not important at that moment. What is important is that he accepts her as she is and sends her away with words of blessing, not words of judgment for being unclean. And it is in that moment that her second healing begins. By accepting her, he begins to heal those unseen wounds caused by the way society has treated her. And that is where she finds peace. Many of us carry with us similar wounds. These are wounds caused by being rejected by our society, by our loved ones when they abuse us or cast us out over things that we cannot control. These are wounds that come from being a woman in a world that treats you like an object rather than a human being. They come from being a person of color in a world that values white lives more than your own. They come from being a queer person in a world that says anything besides straight and cisgender is perversion. These wounds come from being mentally ill in a world that blames its violence on people like you in order to avoid talking about the real problem. They come from being an immigrant in a country that says you don't belong here. They come from being a colonized people and having your history and identity erased by your colonizers. These wounds come from being poor in a country that tells you you don't deserve a living wage and your children don't deserve to eat. They come from constant microaggressions and being told daily by your oppressors that your voice, your experience, your truth is wrong. These wounds come from being part of a system that silences your voice for being different, that casts you out, that shuns you, treats you as though you don't matter, as though you're not really human, and as though you don't really exist. These are the wounds that Dr. Ellison was just talking about on Tuesday when he asked us to remember those times in our lives when we felt unnoticed, unheard, like we didn't exist and our voices didn't matter. These are the wounds that cut us to our very souls, that leave us crying out in the night, "God, why won't anyone listen?" And these are wounds that we rarely talk about. Every week in church, we pray for healing from cancer and strokes and broken bones and other injuries, but how often do we pray for our broken spirits? How often do we ask God to heal those wounds that no one can see? How long do we carry these burdens around with us without considering that we don't have to? But just like the woman, we too can reach out and find healing. We don't have to go on carrying those burdens. We too can find peace. But while we seek healing, there is something else that we need to understand. Unlike the physical healing of the woman's hemorrhage, this healing will not be instantaneous. Some kinds of wounds cannot be healed quickly, and we have to give them time. Although Mark's account of this woman's story ends with Jesus declaring her healed, her story didn't end there. We can only guess at what happened to her afterwards. She may have gone home to her family, where they welcomed her back, embraced her, relieved that they no longer had to be afraid to touch her. Her life might have returned to what it was 12 years before. But I like to imagine that she found a new life, a new home, refusing to go back to those people who had rejected her before. But whatever happened afterwards, wherever she went, whatever she did, we know one thing. The work of healing that began in the middle of the crowd did not end there. That kind of healing can't take place all at once. It takes place over time, sometimes in small steps, sometimes in leaps and bounds. Finding that peace is a long and hard struggle. Sometimes it seems like healing will never come, that it will never get better. But then one day you look back and you marvel at how far you've come. And so I ask you now to consider what your wounds are, what has caused them, and what is causing them. What do they look like? What do they feel like? What area of your life needs healing the most? And when you have answered that question, reach out. Christ is offering healing to us all. And so consider what that healing is. Imagine it, see it in your mind's eye, what it will be like to be healed of these wounds, what your life will look like. In just a moment, we'll be handing out small pieces of clay to all of you. And I invite you to take it and to shape it into whatever you see in your mind right now, whatever healing looks like for you. And then bring that physical representation of your healing forward to place on the table before God. That healing that you see there, it's within reach for all of us. Jesus is offering it, and we just have to stretch out our hands and touch it. And once we do,